All right, so Dark Brandon is back at it again with somewhat of a surprising update here on the ongoing efforts to legalize marijuana at the federal level and to free all nonviolent drug offenders. So there's a lot of caveats that are going into this announcement that he just made yesterday, and we're going to get into all of that. But first off, I just want to show you guys this clip that Biden put out where he was basically, again, announcing this pretty significant step towards decriminalizing marijuana in the United States. So let's go ahead and jump into this clip.
Too many lives have been upended because of our failed approach to marijuana. It's time that we right these wrongs. First, I'm announcing a pardon for all prior federal offenses for the simple possession of marijuana. There are thousands of people who are convicted for marijuana possession who may be denied employment, housing, or educational opportunities as a result of that conviction. My pardon will remove this burden on them. Second, I'm calling on all governors to do the same for state marijuana possession offenses. Third, the federal government currently classifies marijuana as a Schedule I substance, the same as heroin and LSD, and more serious than fentanyl. It makes no sense. So I'm asking the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Attorney General to initiate a process to review how marijuana is scheduled under federal law. Even as federal and local regulations of marijuana change, important limitations on trafficking, marketing, and underage sales should stay in place. Too many lives.
Okay, so that was basically the rough announcement that he made. Now, obviously, again, there are some pretty massive caveats to this entire thing that's going on here, and we actually don't even know the full extent to which this is going to be a really positive thing, because a lot of that is going to be determined by what his Health and Human Services Secretary, as well as the other department that he was announcing, decide to do in terms of how they want to reschedule or completely deschedule marijuana from the controlled substances list. So, a couple of things here. Number one, you could tell that by the language that he was using there, where he says that he is pardoning all prior convictions for possession of marijuana at the federal level. There are some massive caveats to that, right? So when he says prior, the reason why he's using that word is because there are currently, I believe, literally no people who are currently sitting in federal prisons because of a simple marijuana possession, right? So he's not actually like freeing people from jail as a result of these pardons. Now, what he means by that, and he kind of clarified it there in that statement, is that there are thousands of people, I think the estimate is around 6,500 people right now in the United States who do have previous marijuana possession charges at the federal level, who do have a lot of those barriers that are still in place, which is completely fucking ridiculous, right? Makes it harder for them to get, housing, makes it harder for them to get access to social benefits, things like that. So, pardoning them and getting that stain off of their record, that's definitely a good thing. Now, again, that only applies to like a couple thousand people, and he's not really freeing anybody from jail or prisons in the United States as a result of weed charges. Now, part of that is because, again, there are no people sitting in federal prisons or jails because of just a simple marijuana possession. A lot of them that are having those charges right now and are sitting in prison or jail are at the state and local level. So I don't even think that he necessarily has the power to free all of them. Maybe I guess you could if you wanted to just do a blanket clemency or a blanket pardon for everybody across the country. Now, I don't really know like the legal ramifications of that or whether or not he could actually do that and get it through the courts. But regardless, him trying to put at least a little bit of pressure on governors around the country to follow through and do the same thing that he's doing at the federal level within their various states, that would also be massive, and that would actually result in a significant amount of people being let out of jail for those marijuana possessions. So we're gonna have to wait and see like how many governors actually want to do that. Obviously, you're gonna have a lot of these Republicans who are totally not on board with that. So there's definitely a lot of limitations in terms of how many people are going to be actually let out of jail as a result of these pardons that he announced. So that's the pretty major caveat number one. Now, beyond that, again, a large portion of whether or not this is going to be something that we seriously commend him for is going to be on how they are choosing to deschedule or reschedule marijuana. Now, if they put it down to, as he was saying, it's currently a Schedule 1, which is pretty much the most serious classification that you can get, that's completely delusional. It's completely ridiculous. The idea that like marijuana should be up there among, drugs like heroin or LSD, it's completely fucking absurd, right? People across this country have been using marijuana for basically the entire existence of since it was, first grown on this continent. So, the idea that like this is something that is equivalent danger-wise to something like heroin, completely absurd, right? So taking that off of the Schedule 1 and putting it down to like Schedule 3, I think is what you really would be aiming for in terms of like how far Joe Biden would be willing to go. I don't anticipate that he's going to completely deschedule it. That's obviously what he should be trying to do, because if you completely take it off the controlled substances list, that's where it would make the most sense, right? This is not something that needs to be under the authority of like the DEA. It's something that still obviously needs to be taxed and regulated, and all of those other various things that he was saying at the end of that clip, right? You want to make sure that there's not like false marketing on this. You want to make sure that, you know, it's there are some barriers to children getting access to this, because, you know, weed is obviously, I don't think, as catastrophically dangerous to people's health as even something like alcohol or cigarettes, which are still legal in this country. But for kids who do use marijuana, if you are underage, if you're like a young teenager, that can have negative side effects, right? So you do need to have a lot of those regulations in place. But again, taking that off the controlled substances list wouldn't actually prevent that, and it would make it significantly easier to start the process of actually getting this federally legalized across the entire country and not just within various states. So that's the second caveat. Now, there has actually been marijuana legalization that is pretty decent in my view, that has passed the House multiple times now. So here from Human Rights Watch, they say U.S. House of Representatives again passes marijuana reform bill. The MORE Act would begin to address the harm to U.S. communities of color. So this is a good bill because it not only like lays the framework for how you would go about legalizing weed. You do need to do that in the right way, right? You don't want to have a lot of massive corporations stepping in and just creating like a monopoly in this emerging industry. You want to make sure that a lot of funds that are generated from like tax revenue from marijuana legalization and the sales from that, you want to make sure that a lot of those go back towards investments in disproportionately communities of color that have been disproportionately negatively impacted by the war on drugs. And that's sort of where I like make my final conclusion and analysis on this, which is that number one, we're talking about Joe Biden, obviously. Okay, this is a guy who throughout his entire career in the Senate, his entire career as the vice president, and basically throughout his entire political life, this is somebody who has been one of the single most aggressive drug warriors in the history of the United States. Okay, this is a guy who wrote the 1994 crime bill that helped lead to the mass incarceration state that we have right now. So the idea that like he is even doing anything marginally good on marijuana reform, or potentially even rescheduling it down to something like Schedule 3, or maybe in our wildest dreams taking it off the controlled substances list, that's a pretty massive dub, right? This is not something that I was expecting from Joe Biden. I anticipated that we weren't going to see really any major movement in terms of marijuana legalization from Joe Biden, so I'll give him a little bit of credit in terms of moving marginally in the right direction on this. But again, you do have all of those other limitations. And another thing that he snuck into this order that he was issuing as a result of this is that he's not including even undocumented immigrants as part of these pardons that he's announced, which is also just completely ridiculous. The idea that a drug that is so widely used around the United States, that would be something that could lead to undocumented immigrants being stopped and harassed by the police, and then that leading to them being deported, or having some other legal punishments in that sense. So I think that it was really weaselly that he decided not to include undocumented immigrants in this process. But again, this is something that's basically like a first step beyond what this executive order is going to be doing in terms of the pardons as well as rescheduling it. You do need to also be making a massive push right now, and this is where I think Joe Biden is lacking, in that it's not just going to take an executive order or some executive action in order to actually get this completely done. You do need to pair this with legislation through Congress in order to make sure that this is done in the correct way. So Joe Biden should be going out while he's making this announcement and also calling on Congress to actually pass things like the MORE Act, or whatever piece of marijuana legislation that they can come up with to actually get through the House. Now again, that the MORE Act actually did pass through the House multiple times now, so it's just a problem of where the Senate is at. Now I think that this is something that could be somewhat of a bipartisan issue, right? If you look at the polling data on this, it's something that is overwhelmingly popular across the board. Depending on which poll you want to look at, you have overwhelming majorities of Democrats and independents. Pretty much every single poll that you look at will tell you that. And even some polls will show that a majority or close to a majority of even Republicans want to see marijuana legalized. Now, obviously, the benefits of that are pretty obvious. I've talked about this extensively on this channel before. You start the process of deconstructing the failed war on drugs, which, just as a reminder, was initially started. And this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of a former Nixon advisor who I've talked about on this channel before. The war on drugs was initially set out for Richard Nixon to target his political enemies, right? It was started on a completely false premise, the idea that you were doing this to try to crack down on crime or to protect children in some way. They have basically come out, his advisor, as I was just saying, has come out since then and basically admitted that this was a way for them to target the anti-war left at the time and black communities within the United States. So that's why the war on drugs was started in the first place. And so, legalizing it, decriminalizing it, and then taxing and regulating it, and then reinvesting a lot of that money that you get from that tax revenue to reinvest in those communities, that would be absolutely amazing, right? It also starts the process of, making sure that police are not able to just go around and harass people for simple marijuana possession or suspicion of possession of marijuana. That would also have good ramifications down the line. You also start the process of starting to confront our mass incarceration state and our for-profit prison industrial complex, so that's an added benefit. And then you also obviously have the added economic benefits, where this is something where even in like the limited states that it has been fully legalized recreationally, it's already become a multi-billion-dollar industry. I mean, you have some states that are bringing in like tens of billions of dollars potentially in the future on just marijuana sales alone. So this is something that could be massively beneficial across the board. Again, wasn't really expecting any movement on this from Joe Biden, an avid drug warrior throughout his entire career. So I'm glad to see that he's actually doing something. And depending on the rescheduling or the descheduling that his Health and Human Services Secretary decides to go forward with, that will pretty much lay the groundwork in determining how much credit I'm actually willing to give him. Because again, it shouldn't be on the controlled substances list. Alcohol is not on the controlled substances list, and that's something that is still taxed and regulated. And you put those parameters on there. But in terms of like what Republicans are going to do now, I genuinely hope that they dive headfirst into the sort of like drug war propaganda and hysteria and reefer madness type of mindset, because that is something that is absolutely going to hurt them going into the midterms, which kind of ties into the last point about this, which is that I think that part of the reason Joe Biden made this announcement is that we're going into the midterm elections and he needed a little bit of a boost, not just for himself and his approval rating, but also for the broader prospects of the Democratic Party holding on to the House and the Senate. So I think that that will have positive ramifications down the line. I do think that, especially with the young voters who have overwhelmingly been driving Biden's tanking approval rating, this is something that would definitely appeal to younger voters, certainly appeals to me. But again, you have to look at the caveats, you have to look at the limitations, and understand that this is not Joe Biden immediately legalizing weed, but it could be, depending on how they choose to reschedule it, a very, very positive thing. And I will keep you guys updated as we start to get more information in terms of what the actual details of this are going to be looking like.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying